Hello and happy International Women's Day. This is Lindy's Magpie Reads, and I'm coming to you with a celebration of women in history. So I was inspired by a readathon called HerStoryathon that is being organized by Brittany of Literarily Smitten and Charlotte of Coiny Reads. I'll link their information down below. I love reading about women's lives, and it's International Women's Day, so what better time to talk about these books? I have got today 5 picture book biographies that are aimed at children, and they're great for all ages. I have got 2 pictorial volumes that are collected biographies that are aimed at adults, and I've got 1 full-length biography for adults, which is about a lesser-known American-Canadian painter. So all together, these books that I have got here represent 139 different women. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I'm going to give you a taste. So let's start with the picture books. 2 of them are African women, 1 Caribbean, 1 Black Canadian, and 1 Mexican. Idia of the Benin Kingdom. So this one is written by a Nigerian Canadian named Ekiuwa Aire, and it is illustrated by a Ukrainian woman who is, what is her name? Alina Shabelnyk. And I heard about this from the author was doing some kind of Canadian children's book events online, and I didn't watch the event, but I took note because I hadn't heard of her as an author before and found this book at the library. And I'd never heard of Idia before. She lived, she was born sometime in the 1400s, and one of her sons ruled the Benin Kingdom between 1504 and 1550. So she was famous for not only being the Queen Mother, but she also went into battle. Doesn't this photo, this illustration, reminded me of the women warriors of Wakanda from the Black Panther, Marvel Comics. Anyway, she was also famous for healing and her patronage of the arts, for dance, and there are all these works of art in museums around the world, so including this ivory mask that's at the British Museum in London. They think that this is really what Idia looked like. There's a bronze head of Idia. And the story itself imagines what her childhood might have been like. Very appealing illustrations. She and her friend are dancing through the forest. And at the back, there's really a lot of informational back matter. So including the artworks that I showed you, there's a map of the ancient kingdom of Benin, which is in present-day Nigeria, and more information about the people there and the history. So I like this so much that I looked to see what else that author had done. And I got Njinga of Ndongo and Matamba. at least this person I had heard of before a little bit. So Njinga was born in around 1581 and she died around 1663. And again, there's a lot of informational back matter in this one. There's a painting of Queen Njinga. The area that she was queen of is now mostly Angola. And so at the time when she was alive, the Portuguese were trying to take over this area. And her brother was king, and he sent her when Njinga was 16 years old to negotiate with the Portuguese. And so there was this famous scene where when she went into the room where this ambassador was, there was no chair for her. And she was expected to sit down on the floor, which she refused to do. And so this was this famous scene. And it is also written about in this other book by Penelope Bagieux. And I'm going to show you an image from Penelope Bagieux's interpretation, where Njinga gets one of her men to form a chair for her to sit on. And now you can see the illustrations in Njinga. So this is a different artist, not the same one who did the illustrations in Idia. A Russian artist named Natalia Popova. And I don't like her art nearly as well. To me, it looks more like what you would see in a video game. It's pretty flat. The text, however, is excellent. So this is still pretty good. Both of these books are published by Ekiuwa Aire's own publishing house. It's called Our Ancestries. And she created this publishing house because she couldn't find a publisher for her books. I am really impressed with these. And I was pleased to see that Njinga comes up in a list of it's got a long title: African and Caribbean Canadian Books in Color, Recommended Fiction and Nonfiction Resources for K-12 Schools. So this list is actually a collaboration between the Edmonton Public Library, the Sickle Cell Anemia Foundation, and various other community groups. On that list, that's where I found this book, A Likkle Miss Lou. And it is also by a Canadian author, Nadia Hohn, H-O-H-N, and it's illustrated by Eugenie Fernandes. Likkle Miss Lou is a Jamaican poet, Louise Bennett Coverley. And there is a picture at the back of Louise Bennett Coverley. And she was on the radio in England, and she really popularized the use of Jamaican patois. She loved to hear the rhythm of traditional Jamaican mento or folk songs and incorporated that in her poetry. So I'm going to play a little of one of the songs that's mentioned in here, Hill and Gully. Louise Bennett Coverley was born in 1919 and in Jamaica. She moved to England and then eventually to Canada, where she lived for the last 20 years of her life, and she died in 2006. Yeah, another Canadian, and this book was also on that same book list of African and Caribbean Canadian resources for K to 12. This one's called Meet Viola Desmond. Viola Desmond is the first woman to be to have her picture on Canadian money. She's on our $10 bill. So she was also born around the same time as Louise Bennett. She was born in 1914 and she died in 1965. So why is she on Canadian money? Well, she was a trailblazer for equal rights in Canada. She lived in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And in Halifax, movie theaters were integrated. But one night when her car had car trouble, I think this was in 1946, she ended up staying in the town of New Glasgow, where when she went to the movies, she asked for a ticket on the main floor, and the ticket seller gave her a ticket for the balcony where the black people were required to sit. It was unofficial segregation. So she was told she had to move. She went back and asked to pay the extra money because she wanted to sit on the main floor. The ticket seller would not give her a ticket for the main floor. So she went and sat there anyway, and eventually the police came and hauled her off. She was put in jail, and later on was found guilty of not paying 1 cent, the 1 cent in tax that was owed on the surplus of the ticket to sit on the main floor. And so in today's dollars, her fine was $350, the equivalent of $350. And of course that wasn't fair, so that's what started a civil rights action. They took it to the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia. The case was thrown out, wouldn't be heard. And it wasn't until 2010, so long after she had died, that Viola Desmond was pardoned, and the apology also went out to all other black Nova Scotians. And yeah, she's got a star on Canada's Walk of Fame in Toronto now. And that $10 bill was issued in 2018. The author and illustrator are both white for this book. Elizabeth MacLeod, and illustrations by Mike Deas. Got one more picture book, a library for Juana, The World of Sor Juana Inez. It is written by Pat Mora and illustrated by Beatriz Vidal. And this is an updated design. It was originally written in 2002, and the font in that edition was quite small, and I think the illustrations were as well. So look for the 2019 edition, which has got much better font and much larger pictures. They are beautiful. Beatriz Vidal's pictures, her paintings, have lots of rich color and patterning in them, really reminiscent of the Renaissance painters from the 1600s, which is the time that Juana was born. She was born in the mid-1600s. There you can see more of that. The rich blues of, lapis lazuli or ultramarine, and vermilion reds. So Juana learned to read when she was 3 years old, and right from a young age. She told her mom she wanted to go to university, and she was told only boys go to university. So she dressed up as a boy and said, well, that's okay, I'm going. A very persistent girl. And she became very learned. At one point, 40 scholars who didn't believe that she actually knew so much quizzed her on all kinds of subjects. And she answered all their questions. Eventually, she entered a nunnery, and her books of poetry were published. And that's how this book ends, talking about her treasured library. So that's where it's interesting to also have adult books. In the little book of Feminist Saints, there is a section on Juana Inés de la Cruz. And the format of this book is to have just a little one-page brief sort of biographical sketch with a full-page painting. The text is written by Julia Pierpont, and the illustrations are by Manjit Vap. So in this book, we find out that, let me just read this, Juana Inés filled her cell with books, artworks, and musical and scientific instruments. She wrote poems and essays that were published, plays that were performed. After a while, though, her work began to get her in trouble with the church. Her poetry was filled with lustful imagery, and her letters critiqued well-known sermons. She showed too great an interest in secular subjects. To this argument, Sor Juana replied, "One can perfectly well philosophize while cooking supper." And she signed one letter as "Me, the worst of all women." In response, the Catholic hierarchy cracked down. She lost her library, some 4,000 volumes, and all her instruments of study. She was no longer permitted to publish. The church had been her sanctuary, but it was also her cage. We have the life of women in the 17th century and many other centuries. So the way that this book is presented, kind of like a daily devotional where there's a different women on each page, so secular saints. Juana is the matron saint of intellectuals. Some of the other women in here that caught my eye, there's 99 different women in this book. Some that I knew about, like Ruby Bridges, who's the matron saint of First Steps. So in the 1960s, early 1960s, after Brown versus the Board of Education, where she was the first African-American child to attend this all-white school in New Orleans, I had seen the images of her walking up the steps with marshals protecting her from the angry mob of mothers yelling at her. But what I didn't know is that there was only one teacher there who would agree to teach a black child, and Ruby was her only student. Gotta show you Ruby's picture. There she is. And I learned about Helen Hayes. who was an actress. And it mentions that the Helen Hayes Theater is the smallest theater on Broadway. And I thought, wait a minute, I remember that. In 2016, I went with my friend Kathy to New York City, especially to see Fun Home. And while we were there, we saw a couple of other plays, and one of them was The Humans, and it was at the Helen Hayes Theater. So that was kind of cool. So that's all in the little book of Feminist Saints. The drawback here is that each biography is so very short, but you can always go on and find out more from another source. This one is graphic novel format. So for each woman in here, and there are 33 different women in this book. It's translated from French by Montana Kane, and the cartoonist is Pénélope Bagieux. She has quite a wit, and I really enjoyed her graphic nonfiction about these different women, including Frances Glessner Lee, who is known as a crime miniaturist. So this is a woman who made like little miniature scenes, and so to help police when they went to a crime scene, her little miniatures were used for, as a sort of as a study aid. And I had heard about that, but what I didn't know is that she was the main inspiration for the character Jessica Fletcher in the Murder, She Wrote TV series. There's Jessica Fletcher at the back there. I think I'll be coming back to Brazen in a bit, because there's some overlap between these different books. So my last book is a full-length biography, and I'm not going to lift up and show you the cover because it's so glossy, and I'm just going to pop a GIF up there instead. The title is Flower Diary, in which Mary Heaster Reid paints, travels, marries, and opens a door, and it's by Molly Peacock. So, Mary Heaster Reid, or MHR, is the first woman to have a retrospective show at the Art Gallery of Ontario, and that was in 1922. Mary was born in 1854 in the US. She married a Canadian painter, George Reid, and they moved to Canada, and she died in 1921. She left no diaries, very few letters, and so in order for Molly Peacock to write this biography, she had to imagine a lot. One of the things she wrote is that Molly Peacock wrote, "The fact that the letters are so scant in an age when letter writing was the main method of communicating has just a swirl of ashes about it. Someone, sometime, may have done some wholesale burning of documents." And this passage gives you an idea of Molly Peacock's writing style. So her husband, George Reid, was 6 years younger than she was. They both took in art students, and one of their students was also named Mary Evelyn Rinch, and she was about 23 years younger. On Mary Heaster Reid's deathbed, she told Mary Rinch that George would be needing a new wife, and she thought the second Mary would be perfect. And this was witnessed by someone else. And sure enough, George and the younger Mary married less than a year after the first Mary died. So, all very interesting. This book did not exactly work for me because of the writing style. It is a beautiful edition. It's on heavy glossy paper. There's lots of reproductions of Mary Hester Reid's paintings. There's some historical photographs, some of George Reid's paintings where Mary is the subject or the model. But here's some examples of what I didn't like about the writing style. So we're backing up to 1876 when Mary's mother died. And she's getting dressed. Mary stepped into her dark-dyed cotton or linen drawers. Then she donned her cotton or linen chemise. After her chemise, she wriggled into her corset. When her corset was in place, easier if she had someone to help her, but possible to accomplish alone, she squirmed into her petticoat. Over the petticoats, she fixed her corset cover. Then Mary tied her bustle, a wire extension for the derriere, around her waist. She adjusted her underskirt over her bustle. At last, she inched into her skirt itself. As she struggled in the fierce heat of the summer of 1876, she finally writhed on her bodice, blouse, over the chemise and corset. So yes, I get a sense of all the layers of clothing that hampered women of that era, but all of this squirming and wriggling and writhing and struggling to get into the clothing, it's just a little overwritten in my view. So Mary Hester Reid was in the avant-garde of women painting in oils. So she was one of the first to start learning in the US on painting with oils. That was considered real painting because women were allowed watercolors, basically. And so here's another passage where the author, Molly Peacock, is describing painting from life, a male model, nude model. She would paint the cavity of the man's chest, outlining his navel. She would glide her brush over the loincloth emerging on the canvas. She would quicken to paint the veins in his forearms, then summon up the energy to focus on the individual hairs on his thighs, then his calves, then back to the flesh of the ankles and the difficulty of getting those feet. So there's also a lot of ekphrasis, of writing about the art itself, and there were coded elements that were just accepted as part of still life. So for example, in Mary Hester Reid's Still Life with Daisies, the whiskey jug is male, its obvious partner is the full-bellied milk jug with flowers popping out of it, the fertile wife. This is the kind of writing, and yes, I know that that's how these paintings were looked at, but it still seems a bit overreaching. Well, here's a better example. This is Mary Hester Reid's final painting called Past and Present Still Life. It was done in 1918. And Molly Peacock writes, "Two tall red roses lie down like dying soldiers or flu victims, not anchored in water, gasping on a tabletop below an arrangement of dead, preserved grasses." And then several pages later she says, The word pain leaps out of the raw umbers and blacks of Mary's painting. So this is just a little short bit out of several pages of ekphrasis about this painting. I would only recommend this book if you are very interested in little known painters. I did read the whole thing. I didn't bail on it, although I was tempted, so there was enough in there to interest me, but writing is definitely not to my taste. Molly Peacock, by the way, is a well-respected poet. So this HerStoryathon comes with a whole bunch of prompts that Brittany and Charlotte prepared. Prompt number 1 is read about a woman from a different country. And in these books that I read, there are actually 31 different countries. So if I subtract Canada, somebody from a different country, that still leaves 30. And I'm going to read them all to you. Afghanistan, Angola, Apache Nation, Australia, Austria, Canada, Cherokee Nation, China, Dominican Republic, Egypt, England, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, Iran, Jamaica, Japan, Kenya, Liberia, Mexico, Netherlands, Nigeria, Pakistan, Poland, Russia, Sioux Nation, Syria, Uganda, and the United States. Prompt number 2. Read about a non-titled woman. So I would say, there's many for that category, but Louise Bennett Coverley, the poet, is non-titled. And another one that I'll take is Tove Jansson. So what I didn't know about Tove Jansson was that even though her Moomin stories were intended for children, the adventures are also about her life. And for example, these characters, Thingamy and Bob, who walk around holding hands, and they carry with them a suitcase. That suitcase contains a secret they can't tell anyone. And in that suitcase, there's a magnificent ruby, which people are constantly trying to steal from Thingamy and Bob. But this is referring to homosexuality being illegal in Finland at that time, and that Tove was in a secret relationship with a married woman. So, fascinating. Prompt number 3. Read about a local woman. Well, I'm going to use Viola Desmond for that prompt. Nova Scotia is not exactly local. It's on the other side of Canada from Alberta. However, out of all these, it's the closest, so I'll stick with that. Prompt number 4 is read letters, essays, diaries, or a memoir from a woman in history. I don't have any for that. I might read something that fits that prompt later on this month, though. This HerStoryathon actually goes for all of the month of March. In the UK and in the USA, it's Women's History Month in March. Not in Canada. We don't have Women's History Month until October. So that's why I'm doing this all for International Women's Day, which we do celebrate here. Prompt number 5, about a woman you admire. And so this person is, I read about her in Brazen, and it is Lima Bowie. She is a peace activist who helped bring an end to the Second Civil War in Liberia in 2003, and she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011. And by pure serendipity, it also reminded me of the third play that I saw when I was in New York City in 2016, the play Eclipsed, which is about civil war in Liberia. And the production that we saw starred Lupita Nyong'o. Prompt number 6. Read about an underrepresented woman. So one of the things I didn't mention about both Brazen and Feminist Saints is that many of the women in these books are lesser known. And there are also a number of trans women, including Christine Jorgensen, Marsha P. Johnson, and Jin Singh, who I had never heard of before. So I'm just going to show you her page. She's a matron saint of self-invention, a Chinese trans woman who had her own variety show. Prompt number 7. Read about a woman from the pre-1800s. Well, I've told you about Idia of the Benin Kingdom. She was from the 1400s. I told you about Njinga, who's from the 1500s, and Juana, who is born in the 1600s. So those 3, and there are many others in these collected biographies as well, who are from pre-1800s. Prompt number 8. Read about a woman in science. I totaled them up. There are 17 in these books that are about women in science. There's Agnodice, who was a gynecologist of ancient Greece. Temple Grandin, an animal whisperer. Katia Kraft, a volcanologist. Mae Jemison and Sally Ride, who are both astronauts. Hypatia of Alexandria, and Emmy Noether and Ada Lovelace. Those 3 are all mathematicians. Rachel Carson, the biologist. Mary Edwards Walker, who was the first female surgeon in the U.S. She was born in 1832. The quote that's in the Feminist Saints: "I don't wear men's clothes. I wear my own clothes." She's someone who liked to wear pants. There's Marie Curie and her daughter Irene Joliot-Curie, who are both physicists. Oh, and Lisa Meitner, another physicist. And then Grace Hopper and Margaret Hamilton, and they were both computer programming engineers. Juana Inez de la Cruz, she was an environmentalist. I don't know about her scientific instruments, what else she used for studying, but I imagine the natural world around her. And also Hedy Lamarr. So this was new to me about her as well. I knew that she was an actress. I did not know that she was an inventor. And even in Austria, where she was born, Inventor's Day is celebrated on her birthday, which is November 9th. So, of the many things that she invented, probably the most exciting thing was something that she came up with for improving radar during World War II. And she donated this invention to the U.S. Army who just sort of filed it away and didn't use it. But eventually, somebody noticed, hey, this is pretty smart. And it led to developing GPS and Wi-Fi and some other technologies. So thank you, Hedy Lamarr. Prompt number 9 is read about a woman you've never heard of before. I've already talked about some that I've never heard of before, but I particularly want to mention Georgina Reed. So she was born in 1908 in Trieste in Italy, and then emigrated as a girl, to the US. And what she did was she invented a way to stop the ocean from eroding the seashore. She and her husband, after they retired, moved to the Atlantic coast, and soil erosion was a problem with storms. And so her method is actually based on Japanese gardening technique, and she used her method to save the Montauk Lighthouse. She and a group of volunteers, using her method. So very cool. And so many women. Well, the other thing that's happening on International Women's Day is the Women's Prize for Fiction long list is being announced. So I'm recording this in advance of March 8th, but I am looking forward to seeing that long list. And I would also like to see if any of you are participating in HerStoryathon and what books you're reading for these different prompts, or if you've read any of these books that I've talked about, or have things to say about these women that I've been talking about. And there's lots of room in the comments below, so please talk to me. Thank you so much for watching.